I'm Wendy Smith, and I'm by training an art historian.
And I'm Lisa Woolfork. By training, I am a professor in African American literature and culture. So I do literary studies, and you are an art historian.
Mm-hmm.
And we are both here today to talk about the engagements program and how the engagements and the ways that it divides into the categories of aesthetics and difference as two of the four main categories, and how that works with our teaching and our research and our perspectives on other things. So do you want to get started telling them about your class?
Sure. The class that I'm teaching right now has to do with time and memory in the arts, and how our perceptions of time and the way that we perceive memory and experience memory shapes the way we create art and the way that we view art. And so from an aesthetic point of view, thinking a lot about literature and how certain authors try to provoke memory in you.
Yes.
A lot of times that happens with like really minute specific details or the way they paint a picture. And we talk a lot about sensory memory and the way that sensory experiences can bring up memories kind of suddenly. They rush forth and they seem almost outside of time, the way that they suddenly bring you back to a place.
It's interesting to think about time, and the way you're helping us to work through it is that some folks think about time as a stable noun, as a thing, as opposed to time as a verb. And so I was just thinking today in one of my classes that I'm teaching right now, one of my students was saying that with the introduction of the railroad, time became standardized across the country. And before it wasn't that way. So you could imagine that the way that people in Missouri, for example, thought about what 9 p.m. was very different than someone in Virginia thinking about what 9 p.m. was. And even the AM PMs, those are things that are, those are pretty like novel concepts, and how they came from industry. They came from,
the Industrial Revolution. We actually talked about that today in my class. We talked about, specifically in Paris, when the factories started implementing clocks to segment up the day shifts for workers, and how time and the way we think about time is so much really from the start impacted by our ideas of labor and domestic travel and things like that. And like you're saying, they affect different people differently. And I think in contrast to maybe agrarian time, where you when you don't go by a clock.
You don't go by the clock. You go by the, as some folks say, you work from can't see in the morning till can't see at night. It's that, so like you work longer during the long days and you work less when you can't see at night in the dark. So that agrarian is a really interesting frame to think about time. One thing that I was interested in was thinking about how the past itself, and this is something that we see in Charlottesville, this is something that we see in thinking about Confederate memory, about thinking about plantations without erasing slaves from them in order to preserve those parts that white people are most interested in, how that too is dependent on certain ideas about time. That time in the past has been construed as sacred and inviolable. This is something that I've seen in people who want, for example, to revere Thomas Jefferson and think about him as a man of his time.
Oh, I see.
He's a man of his time, therefore any flaws, any harmful things, any dangerous acts, any hypocrisies that he recognized even in himself, any racist ideas, all of those are somehow meant to be absolved because of time.
All of that also depends on this perception of time as completely linear, and this idea of progress, and that, well, he was back here, in the past, when we've progressed so much since then, so now we don't have any, we should be better than that. But he had an excuse because he's way further back on the timeline.
Exactly.
But we know, just in fact, looking around every day, that that's not true.
That's right. That's right. And that there were people, even during Jefferson's time, who were critical of Jefferson's racism. There were people who were critical of the slave empire that had taken over the South and fueled the rise of this country. And so when we think about time, I've been finding it really interesting to listen to, there's the 1619 project that the New York Times has done, and it also has a podcast.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. And so something we're doing right now in my class that I'm teaching in the English department, it's contemporary African American literature. and I've asked them to look at episode 2 of the 1619 Project, which is just a 30-minute podcast episode discussion of the economics of slavery. And it's really important, I think, to realize how much of America's wealth and the infrastructure of democracy was founded on slavery and on extracted labor and on constructing laws that preserved inequity in a country that believed so strongly in freedom and independence that they overthrew their own government to create a new government.
Painful irony.
It's quite, it is indeed. Painful irony are 2 words to describe exactly that. You know, that they would overthrow Britain only to establish 400 years or 300 years of perpetual discrimination and brutality.
One of the other things that made me think of, you were talking about the economic gains that white Americans benefited from the institution of slavery, but I think there's also, if we look kind of from an aesthetic point of view, there are so many cultural, artistic gains, ways that white Americans have profited off of the cultural production of Black Americans.
Absolutely.
And we see that, we talk about appropriation a lot, and you see that so much in contemporary culture and just pretty much since we've all been living together.
It's true. It's true. And this notion of thinking about aesthetics and difference as if these are not, as if these are 2 separate categories rather than mutually constitutive categories. That the category of difference is informed heavily by aesthetics, and difference is registered through aesthetics in the same way that the category of aesthetics itself is constructed by and run through with issues of difference. So like in a contemporary scene, I was thinking about, I saw this meme the other day, and it was talking about how Beyonce, who was nominated for an Emmy Award for her production of Homecoming, lost to James Gordon's car karaoke special episode with Paul McCartney. So
yes, I saw the same article. I think it was about the editing for each one and like how much more involved Beyonce's project was than this silly car thing. I mean, it's a funny car thing.
It's funny, but it's like a 20-minute.
Right.
It's just
not this huge, like really thought-provoking project.
It's not a major production that involved years of making, that involves centering the lives and voices of Black people and Black history. It's not, you know, and there was another, and someone made a similar comparison to Beyonce losing her Lemonade nominations and awards to Adele, another white British woman, and then losing the video awards to another white person, like maybe to Taylor Swift or something that makes like no sense at all. But it's just about the resilience and reserve and commitment of privileging and prioritizing white people and white people's practices over the work of Black folks.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what we were just talking about, speaks to the way that these aesthetic creations have been judged. But I think we also see it in just the creation of other aesthetic works. Like there's so many times where I've seen people discuss how Taylor Swift keeps co-opting Beyonce.
Yes.
That keeps happening.
Yes, copying, like a marching band, a pyramid, staying on top of the pyramid. And it's just like, didn't Beyonce just do this like a year ago at Coachella? And you're doing this now and thinking that no one's going to notice? And if the reverse had happened, it would be Beyonce would be exposed as a copier, as not creative, as co-opting. And yet Swift is allowed to kind of get away with that because she is given this sense of renewable innocence, you know, all the time. I could talk a little bit about the classes that I taught in the program. I taught 2 classes. One was called Race, Racism, Colony, and Nation. That was my class in difference. And then I co-taught with a colleague a class called Making the Invisible Visible. Both of those were fantastic experiences. And I'm actually working on a new class now called Sally Hemings University.
Oh wow, I'd like to hear more about that.
And so basically what I'm trying to do is to reimagine the University of Virginia as a place. They often talk about UVA as Thomas Jefferson's University or
Yes,
Mr. Jefferson's University, and there's a lot of pride built into that. There's a lot of the idea that he was a U.S. president, and he was a philosopher, he was a statesman, and all of these things that are built into Jefferson's legacy, and how part of that is in Monticello, of course, and also in the University of Virginia. But I was motivated by the dean of the arts, the dean of arts and sciences, Ian Balcom, at one event a few years ago that I went to, and he says that we wanted to be clear that this is just as much Sally Hemings University as it is Thomas Jefferson. And that had me thinking about what would Sally Hemings University look like?
Yeah.
What would be privileged and exalted? What would we see in every classroom on the wall? Like we see the honor code being written on the walls, and people have to pledge them in their exams. The kind of imaginative space to do this is a class. And so that's what I'm working on now for next semester. But it picks up on some of these same questions about how do we define belonging? How do we define a pedagogical approach to aesthetics and difference and ownership and property? How do we decenter a type of patriarchy in order to center something on Black women and Black women's vulnerabilities and Black women's resilience? And so that was what I'm trying to work on as a part of this kind of cognitive and pedagogical project, this experiment for this class. But we read some really great things. We read a lot, Ta-Nehisi.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Yes, we read Ta-Nehisi Coates. We read Frederick Douglass, read the Declaration of Independence. We read like newspaper articles about things that were kind of current events or events about this recent article. Well, not recent. This was maybe 10 years ago, about a family who was deprived of their Fourth Amendment protections when they got their house raided over a failed tomato plant.
That's so strange.
Yes. So, but the who does the drugs? ATF, alcohol, ATF, whoever or maybe the DEA. Oh. It was one or the other, either the DEA or the ATF. I think it was DEA though. Had spotted the wife. Had found in their trash can green clotted materials, and they took that to be marijuana, and thought that they were operating a grow house, when in fact the father was doing a homeschool project with lighting and this tomato plant. The green globule stuff that they found was Tivana tea leaves that the wife, because Tivana tea is really good. It's expensive, but it's really good.
You can see the leaves.
You can see the leaves and the stems and a little bit of seed, and they thought, oh, clearly this is marijuana. And so, which is funny because marijuana is not a narcotic, and it doesn't, and where people were living, I think it might have been Kansas or something. It's like even the prosecution for it is in like felony prosecution. I mean, so it was just basically a basic overreach. And so we looked at that to talk about the Fourth Amendment, to talk about what happens when this happens to a white family. What are some recourses that they might have available to them that aren't available to, for example, if this was a Black family. Why was this family able to kind of bring this case all the way to the state Supreme Court and beyond to seek redress, when if it was a Black family or especially a Black low-income family, they might not have had all the money to hire lawyers and pursue it and stuff like that. So it was a really great class, and we did had a lot of really interesting conversations. So it's just been the college fellows and the experience of working in the engagements has been some of my most exciting and interesting and fun teaching experiences that I've had in my nearly 20 years at the university. I've really enjoyed the classes and getting to know the students and to get them to think beyond what's happening on the page in my syllabus or in the rooms of the classroom into how this connects in other aspects of their life. And that's been very successful, I think.
Right. Yeah, and I too, I've enjoyed how it's not so discipline specific. You
That's
can
right.
just kind of pursue the issue where it goes.
That's right. That's
you
right.
don't have to be limited to, oh, this isn't the type of question we look at in
art
or
history
in
or in
English.
English. Yes, no, but that's not relevant for
Right.
this. This is
Right.
not. This is not related to literary study. This is
Right.
this is something different.
You just
And so-
follow where the material
And
is.
just see what happens. And just see what happens. Have you had any favorite things that you've done that with your students about, like, going beyond the disciplines that you have in art history to do something to think about aesthetics more broadly?
So we talked a lot about sensory memory provoking different things through artworks and through literature, and I had a few students who were really interested in psychology,
Yes.
and they brought up some really interesting points about the way memory works,
Mhm.
and from kind of a more psychological and even kind of biological and chemistry
Wow,
perspective. So there's a big
goodness.
science overlap with this as well.
That's fantastic. That's kind of unexpected.
Right, and it's outside of what I really know in my
Right.
background, so it's great to have them come in with their expertise, because this is
That's
something
right.
I tell them on the first day. They all have their own body of knowledge,
They
and they
do.
all have their own experience,
They
and
do.
they're bringing that to what we learned, and if they're not there, we don't get that perspective. So that's why
Exactly.
each of them is important.
And each person brings a unique contribution. And I had similar things where people were taking political science classes where they were looking at the rise of American democracy and could talk about some of the context for who voted for this clause and who didn't vote for this clause and what they thought it meant at the time. And that really shaped the way that the conversation unfolded. And I thought those are the kind of things I really appreciated. So I think we just close this by
Okay.
saying that aesthetics and difference are two ideas that are mutually constitutive. They go together like peanut butter and jelly or peanut butter and chocolate, like a Reese's cup. But some people are allergic to peanut butter, but you won't be allergic to this. This is, the purpose of this is meant to cross disciplinary boundaries. And there is more benefit to having those boundaries crossed than there are to having them separate. And it's really wonderful to share that type of cross-pollination with students so early in their time at the university, because that way they can start to think beyond the boundaries of what's
Right,
possible for
right.
them.
Right, and we want it to be evident that these two things can't be separated, really. And even among all four of the engagements, when we're thinking responsibly about a new issue or a new topic, we want to come at it from all of these sides, really.
That's right. That's right. So thank you so much for watching, and we hope that you continue to enjoy the program and continue to make your own cross pollinations.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.